All right. Good evening. This is the June education meeting of the School District of Upper Dublin. I welcome all administrators, fellow board members, committee members, and members of the public. June is an amazingly busy month of the school year anyway, and I think this year especially so. We have seen an enormous amount of activities, and I think before we go into the actual education meeting, I would like to give the opportunity to Board President Amy Franczak to speak a few words that are pertinent to our district and the larger community that we live in. So I think Ms. Franczak, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Titia. Tonight I'd just like to share with the community, the administration, and our students as well, a joint statement of unity on behalf of our school board members and the members of the administration of the Upper Dublin School District. The death of George Floyd and the events that have transpired since are sobering reminders that we have a long journey ahead of us as a country toward genuine acceptance and respect for all. Eradicating racism, bias, and hate will take the collective education and hard work of our nation. And as a community, we must embody our district's shared value of embracing, celebrating, and promoting respect and appreciation for all people. The Upper Dublin School District will continue empowering students by providing access to the best educational opportunities possible, resolve that skin color, gender, orientation, ability, or disability, beliefs, or any other social construct must never dictate one's education and experiences in our schools. Therefore, to ensure that our students have equitable access to high quality instruction, the district has eliminated track 3 low-level courses at both Sandy Run Middle School and Upper Dublin High School, and has removed the laborious against educational advice process and prerequisites to honors and advanced placement classes. Implementing a new gifted education screening tool that was void of bias has also been a focus of the district. The following are additional examples of the educational equity work in which we will continue to engage as we move our district forward. First, the focused recruitment of teachers and administrators of color. Next, the redevelopment of curricula focused on skills and standards delivered with culturally responsive materials that will prepare students for college and career. Revisions to schedules allowing greater student access to teachers for enrichment and intervention during the school day, and renewed commitment to positive behavior intervention support, or PBIS, and restorative practices to address behavior. As we move forward, we will also continue engaging our staff in meaningful conversations and professional development focused on implicit bias, as well as educational equity and justice. Enveloping our students in courageous conversations and collaboration with our staff will lead to greater understanding and respect for all. Our Equity and Empowerment Steering Committee will serve as advisors as we engage in this important work. Our district stands with our students and families of color and reiterates our commitment to welcoming, inclusive, and safe learning environments. Ensuring that all students and staff in Upper Dublin School District feel respected and valued, and that all members of our school community demonstrate respect and value for each other remains our priority. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Franczak. And I think we should all keep in mind these words, and not just for now, but as we move on with our lives and everybody's life, that this stays a focus for the district and all of us individuals. In terms of the agenda today, we have 2 presentations related to continuity of education and the preparation for the next school year. Then there are a couple of items that will be discussed in preparation for the legislative meeting. But I think I would first like to definitely congratulate our graduates who we saw pass on us on Monday. Also want to thank everybody who was involved in preparing that event. It was, I think, a very festive event. I hope the graduates felt celebrated and their families as well. And I really want to thank everybody who pulled this together in a creative way. Staff, administration, PTA, PTOs, and all members of the community. And also congratulations to the 5th and 8th graders as they get promoted to their next level of education within the district. I think it's now Dr. Yanni's turn to make a couple of announcements. Dr. Yanni.
Thank you, Mr. Sherpier, for the introduction, and to Mrs. Francic for making the statement. I wanted to let everyone know that we really did have several great graduation events. We're really thankful that everyone rallied around our 2020 graduates. We had in-person graduations last week and the week before. We had the gauntlet on Monday evening. We had the Sandy Run car parade yesterday, and we've had the Fort Washington, Jaredtown, and Maple Glen promotion parades so far. Last but certainly not least is Thomas Fitzwater on Friday. Friday is the last day of the school year for our students. Our staff wraps up next week, and then we will be planning, and we'll talk in just a couple of minutes about what planning is starting to look like for the fall. So I really want to thank our entire community and our entire staff. It was great to see for our graduates class of 2020, the number of teachers that supported the gauntlet the other evening. Every building in the district was really well represented, and we had all of our board members there as well. So thank you for all that. And with that, I will wait until we start our presentation to share additional information.
All right, thank you, Dr. Yanni. And I would be remiss if I wouldn't especially welcome Ms. Rita Perez as our new member to the administrative team. I am sure that she has her work cut out for her and that you will hear much more from her in the weeks and months to come, but I would like to welcome her to this education meeting. That gets us to number 4.4 in our agenda, the minutes of the May 6th meeting. Are there any comments or questions about these minutes? I am not seeing any hands, so I would recommend that we move them to the legislative meeting, right? All right. That then gets us to our first presentation, the continuity of education discussion. We have building principals present for that occasion, as well as a number of administrators. So I hand over the microphone to, I believe it's Mr. Hoffman.
Yes, so we have each of our buildings represented by their principal this evening. At the middle of May, we surveyed our community on the continuity of education plan so that we could have a better understanding of how that plan was implemented, the systems that we had in place for communication, the amount of time that we were looking at completing assignments, and then obviously the opportunity to offer some open-ended comments. We had over 900, Dr. Yanni, was that the final count? I forgot to look at that one piece today. I believe it was maybe 950.
Yes, we had just over 950 responses
from our community, which was really great. I'd say overwhelmingly, the plan that we had in place at about 65 to 70%, it was just the right fit for our families, and that was our goal from the beginning of our plan, to create a continuity of education plan that was sustainable from the very first day that we began implementing it, and that we could stay focused on that essential learning through the end of the school year. And where many local districts had to pause and pivot, I'm really proud of our teachers and our students and their families at being able to maintain that focus on the 5E framework for the essential learning that we were engaged upon. The feedback for the written information we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to 5B. But what we've asked each of the building principals to share a snapshot of what they learned from the review of the data that we gathered from that continuity of education plan. So we'll begin with elementary and work our way to high school.
I can get started for Maple Glen. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Had an opportunity. There was a lot to look over, and you try and form the best conclusions to inform next steps and practice. And some of the positive trends, some of the things that I noted was a description of work in multiple grade levels seemed to be favorable across the board. I also noted that locating lesson and materials, was favorable. Grade 5, it was really strong. No one disagreed with that. And just thinking of our kids K through 5 and what that looks like from a kindergartner all the way up through a 5th grader, being able to access those materials, locating them, that was something that was really positive to me that stood out. And I also felt that it was noted that there was feedback from our teachers, and just reviewing some of the anecdotal notes, that seemed favorable in some of the things that I was reading. Some areas of improvement, I try not to just focus on Maple Glen and especially just myself as a principal. I think it's more about our school and our district, and I try and think bigger picture, but it's hard to separate things that focus maybe on the building level. And so one thing that stood out was school communication, at least at Maple Glen, particularly in my upper grades, seemed to be something where I had a few grade levels where the numbers weren't favorable in terms of school communication. So that would be something that I myself will look at and make sure that I'm improving in that area for our school. We go through different times where you're sending out multiple emails, and you're trying to balance that with how much those on the receiving end are getting. But that's something that I'll continue to focus on. I noted here that another area of improvement was, just like I listed it as a positive, it was also an area of improvement with feedback and just virtual time for new instruction. But I saw both ends in terms of feedback from teachers. And then I also saw different presentations of work was something that we noticed, and it came up like the week at a glance documents at some grade levels may have been shared earlier in the week, but then lessons weren't there in the Google Classroom platform until later in the week. And some of those things that leads to informing practice. I think as a teacher, it's so hard to provide a full week's lessons without seeing the work you're getting back from your students to inform your lessons. But finding ways to do that is really important. We have learning support teachers that are making modifications, or they have to make sure things are reaching their learners the right way, and they need the turnover time for that. So really balancing that out and figuring out that workflow is really important. I think, using daily instruction or assessment to inform planning And the last thing that I noticed is certainly that our community values our teachers, and they want more new learning from our teachers. I kept reading that time and time again in the anecdotal notes.
Thanks, Rob. Town?
You're welcome, Dave.
Dave, I can jump in for Jarretttown. Rob, thank you for leading the way on this one. We appreciate that.
Absolutely.
We have 321 families at Jarretttown and 151 responded. So about 36% of our parents responded, which is always good to get every response. But I think a lot of times when we, sometimes silence is, means agreement. So we're going to go with that. First I looked at the Likert scale type of questions, which were overall positive. Regarding the logistics of accessing links, 96% agreed they were able to access everything. There really wasn't an issue there, which was wonderful. Regarding the work assigned, well, first off, in the area of communication for both teacher and the school, 90% of the respondents felt that it was just right. So again, that was, that was very positive, and we were glad about that. Regarding the actual work assigned, this is where we start to see some differences. 68% felt that the work was just right. A few assignments they said were too hard, but I know that our teachers were really working out and reaching out to our students who were having difficulty, especially when they were able to hand assignments in and they were reaching out and taking care of that. 21% of our parents in this particular survey noted that they felt that some of the work was too easy. So when one of the goals that Dr. Yanni had said is we should be reflecting on this data and to see where it's going to lead us in the future. So as we reflect on this to inform our practices, if we were again presented with this virtual learning necessity, I think working on differentiation for some of our higher level students would be a priority. That piece of it. In the classroom, it happens so naturally, but virtually, we want to make sure that we're going to have to figure that out a little bit more. During this time period, our teachers did an excellent job adhering to the most essential standards to ensure the students continued their progress. I worked with kindergarten and first grade. Each of our principals, as you know, were assigned certain grade levels, and their dedication was just unmatched, and their thought process of what their children would be able to do, always worrying about not only the academic piece, but the social emotional piece and how this was affecting their children. So, this was a big piece. It's not just one prong. Also, I think that when we think about the respondents, 82% of the people who responded actually did add a written comment. And I'm going to agree with Rob there that many comments were positive. They felt that the district did a really nice job, but there was one common thread. Many parents noted that they were pleased with our whole program, but however, if the need arises for virtual learning again, they would really like more synchronous type of learning. And Dr. Yanni in several of our leadership team discussions has noted that we would move in that direction if needed. Overall, our program offered a meaningful and educational experience to our students. Our leadership team in the curriculum office, with Dave and Meredith and all the teachers and the supervisors, they did an incredible job they took the time to create a program that was meaningful, but it also presented a unified program throughout the district. Our goal as a district was to keep our children safe in the virtual world, which, if you recall, that was one of our concerns, all of the Zoom bombing that was happening in the beginning, and there were some unsafe practices going on online that had us very concerned. So my hat goes off to Philip Vinogradov. He did an amazing job accomplishing this and finding that safe environment would allow us then to move on to our live Google Meets. This response was overwhelmingly positive, just as much for the teachers as for the students, because the feeling of missing each other was mutual. Overall, I feel that, based on our circumstances and what we were trying to do, I've worked with our dedicated teachers and our leadership team. I think if we are moving to the next level, if this ever happened again, which we may or may not know for sure, working a little bit more on synchronized, as well as having our teachers creating more of their educational videos would be a good start, along with looking a little bit more differentiation for a higher level. But I am very proud to be part of this team. I think the data shows us both pieces. It shows us the positive, and it shows us areas where we all need to grow, but that is common in all life. We all need to grow. But overall, I applaud our leadership team and our teachers and our students and our parents who have become teachers, because I think this was a successful venture.
Thank you. Mr. Alston?
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
I don't have a lot to add to what Meg and Rob said, but as the third grade principal, I really focused not only on what happened at Fitz, but what happened in third grade, and just seeing, you know, if we were having a right fit. What I noticed, and as I did a little bit more pushing, when it came to students that had IEPs, we did struggle a little bit more with making sure that the work was not too much for them. In fact, just doing a little research, most of the students that were spending above 3 hours had IEPs of the ones who had responded to this survey. That is something that I feel very challenging. I know that we're always trying to close the achievement gap, but at the same token, we have to make sure that we are hitting students exactly where they are. And one of the consistent complaints that I got with the asynchronous learning was with students that had IEPs. Looking at the number of people who actually filled it out, and I did receive emails. I think Meg touched on something. Most of the people who were truly happy didn't respond or say anything, you know, but I would hear from parents and families via email. Moving forward in next steps, you know, as we plan on what we're doing in the fall, just making sure that all of our students are truly getting what they need, and how can we have not only synchronous learning, but learning at a pace that is appropriate for the students that have individualized education plans. You know, we're supposed to differentiate, and the differentiation was much more challenging with this particular format. Although I agree with my two colleagues, we absolutely got big time kudos and rave reviews. I'm just always looking at every student, so that could just be me, but I'm always concerned when it's one student that's not getting everything that they need.
Mr. McAleer, thank you.
Last but not least, a lot of the same things. Working with fourth and fifth grade, it was nice because you're working with teachers across the entire district, which was really nice to see that collaboration amongst staff members. And then to sit down and look at how your school looked K to 5, it was interesting. I agree with all three principals. I think strong areas at Fort Washington, location of lessons and materials. I think teachers did an amazing job posting their work in their Google Classrooms. I think this gave teachers an opportunity. Some teachers that weren't as tech savvy are going to come back in September being really strong technologically, which I think was one thing that comes out of this. That's a really good thing. Communication from teachers, staff, school districts, strong across all areas there. There's some outliers, some small little outliers. Some said too much, some said too little, but the majority are saying it was just right. We have 503 students at Fort Washington. We had 118 surveys filled out, a couple repeats, so I think it's possibly about 110. So I'm thinking about a quarter of our school filled in the surveys. Some areas that were interesting, it seemed like I was shocked that there were some kindergartners doing 3 to 4 hours of work each day. I think going into this, and I think one message, I think all of us did, I think in the beginning, they were doing all the optional work. They were doing every little piece of work, and they were becoming overwhelmed. And I think the message midway through was, it's okay to not do art one day. It's okay to not do phys ed one day. And, do the core curriculum items. I mean, I think kids were walking 10 miles a day during the shutdown. So they were doing phys ed on a daily basis. Description of work, it seemed great. You know, there's a couple grade levels where there were some inconsistencies, but mostly just right. And kind of what Meg was saying, when I looked at the comments and all the anecdotal notes, kind of the same thing. More synchronous learning. I did hear, it seems like there's a lot of feedback from working parents. I heard that a lot. It was challenging at times for working parents when it was asynchronous learning. So, you know, if this were to continue in the fall, they would like a more synchronous approach. But I think, you know, leaving school March 11th, having Meredith and Dave lead us into this, the majority was positive feedback from everybody. Even things like the parades, I think families like that approach better than sitting in an auditorium with 400 people. It was really child-centered. But I do feel we did a very good job. I do agree with what Peter said. I think some of the struggles were students with IEPs, and that's something we look at if we go into this in the fall. But the majority of people were very happy. I think we are going in the right direction.
Thank you. Now move to middle school, Dr. Clark. Dr. Clark, you're muted.
That would make sense if I turned on my speaker, my microphone. Okay, good evening once again. The time spent on schoolwork, students in grades 6 and 8 spent between 2 and 3 hours. That's the majority. And then the students in grade 7, the majority spent between 3 and 4 hours. So we often talk about 7th grade being the biggest challenge for students at the middle school. So that time spent is not really a surprise. In terms of description of work, grades 6, 7th, and 8th, the majority of the respondents responded just right. In terms of locating lessons and materials, again, all 3 grades agreed that they were easy to find. Teacher staff communication, grades 6, 7th, and 8th, responded that it was just right. School communication, again, just right from all 3 grades. And the last, so here's what I want to say overall, reiterating some of the things already said. For staff, having had the opportunity to meet with teachers daily, join their meets and see their lessons, I'm impressed and proud of the way they created lessons in the 5E framework and continuously work to meet the needs of children and families. I reminded staff often when they were grinding 7 days a week long beyond their contractual hours that we have no pandemic pile of plans because they were working very hard. And I told them to get through these weeks, like almost 13 weeks, pacing is essential. In terms of the students, I was in communication with students across all the grade levels, and it was no surprise that most of them rose to the challenge before them. They were asking relevant questions and made salient suggestions. They responded to their teachers and expressed how much they missed them. If there was ever any doubt in a teacher's mind about their impact, our time away from students during our closure was proof that they are loved and respected. And for the parents, so many shared their appreciation and patience with us, realizing that our traditional lessons and teaching could not be perfectly replicated in an online environment. So as we organize pickup of parent payments in our safe instruments, soft pretzel and bread recipe ingredients, locker content bags, and book return, parents were so very responsive. Our first day of returning books was, the line got long, but we fixed it for 7th and 6th. So we appreciate all the staff, all the students, and the parents as well. So I've broken down pros and cons and the trends and the similarities will evolve. So in the 8th grade summary, the positives were, and these are quotes, direct quotes, we feel like the district's doing an excellent job. Thank you for all your efforts. I know the teachers are working super hard in all of this. It's a big challenge. Health and safety of the students, teacher and staff are primary concern in returning to school. And again, thank you. Some of the cons from 8th grade. Some of the lessons have been too demanding in terms of assuming materials and resources are in the household. Poor lessons and use of virtual tools. Disappointed there is no live instruction. Need more structure. It's difficult for kids to focus, and there's simply too much work given. And I think we've all shared these concerns at the very, very beginning. We didn't go directly into Zoom, right? There was some Zoom bombers or whatever the term was. So we didn't go there initially. And in terms of finding out what materials and resources were in the homes, teachers, I saw learning curve, and I saw teachers make adjustments and changes, and parents did as well. The grade 7 summary, pros, teachers are doing what they can, but they're limited. Thank you. Thank you for doing your best in an unprecedented situation. Thank you for your hard work. The communication from the teachers is great for the kids. The cons in 7th grade, too many forums to check about work and submit work, too many emails. And someone else mentioned that earlier in this meeting this evening, where we walk that fine line between too many emails and not enough communication. So just something to pay attention to for the future. Some class
I believe
thanks for all your hard work. We know it's not been easy. Very impressed by certain teachers. And some teachers were named. I communicated with teachers and other staff members that have answered me very completely and thoroughly. Thank you to Upper Dublin School District during this time. Cons, Schoology does not provide an updated real-time status of work and assignments. Communication has been poor. Sometimes it's like a scavenger hunt trying to figure out what to do daily. Middle school materials are not properly organized. How to submit different types of assignments has been the biggest frustration. So again, when meeting with the teachers daily, weekly, they know and they're aware of some of this feedback that parents and students have shared with them. So they have their own, they'd like to spend some time next week actually debriefing, right? And warehousing what they know is best, and then discarding some of the things that they did initially, since they did not have the results that they had hoped for. So lastly, and I had a slideshow, so I'm sorry if I'm reading to you, but I am. Suggestions, math needs to be taught through video or live. Have the kids email daily with their teachers. I wish there were an organized list of assignments for each class. Have online classes like Zoom. Live instruction with scheduled classes is needed in order for continued success for each student. Need more time teaching with teachers and not just videos to watch. And having all info in the lesson plan would be helpful with links to everything. So I've shared my slides. I took the large body of slides, created middle school specific slides, and I will share that with the leadership team, Steve and Rob, that are there, because all these conversations will come to the fore again when, as a whole faculty, they're able to discuss it. And that concludes middle school summary.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Mr. Schultz for the high school.
Absolutely, and I know it's not part of the survey results, but I do want to give a proper thank you to all who contributed to making teaching and learning over the last 3 months as good as it can be. The central office work of Steve and Dave and Kim Schuler and Phil Vinogradov was outstanding, and the responsiveness to needs at various times was incredibly helpful. Our supervisors were fantastic. Our teachers were the best, and our guidance counselors really spent an amount of time helping, and especially helping those students who were struggling. So I just wanted to put that out there. Positive trends, we found that rigor, communication, resources, we got very consistent and very high responses to all of that, thinking that the level of academic rigor was just right, that the communication from the school and from the teachers was spot on, and that the resources were readily available. I think a lot of the work that we've done in the past, moving to the Schoology platform, certainly helped with that, but that seemed to be a fairly seamless instruction. I think for this time, 2/3 of our students spending 2 to 5 hours daily on their schoolwork was a good amount, and it was an appropriate amount, but I want to get back to that when I talk a little bit more about needs. And the students, I mentioned before, their ability to access, but also to understand what was being presented, what was being taught, and what was being expected was was a strength. I think I've heard it at every single level now, but the one piece that was reiterated time and time again through the comments was the need to provide more options for synchronous instruction. I don't think anybody questions why we did that, and I think, again, it was appropriate for this time. But if we are going to, and hopefully not, but if we are going to move forward with this type of learning platform in the future, we are going to need to increase our ability to do it in a synchronous way, and thus improve the engagement of some of our students. And then looking for needs for improvement, the synchronicity is definitely one, but I do want to get back to that 2 to 5 work hours per day. In the study that Dr. Yanni shared with us and that we discussed as an educational leadership team, we do realize that there was a loss of instructional time, and I think we have provided enough of a foundation that we can look to see what gaps need to be filled when we hopefully get back to school in the fall. But if for some reason we are out of school, I do believe that we're going to have to look for larger periods of engagement for high school students than where we currently are. And then on a final note, in terms of experience, we did find that students that have learning differences and struggles did need more support. I mentioned the amount of work that our guidance counselors did. They were very helpful there. Our special education teachers were fantastic during that time. But if we need to, possibly we can re-examine what are the job responsibilities of our co-teachers if we were to return to this platform, and maybe their focus could shift a little bit from the co-teaching work to giving more frequent support to the students on their caseloads.
Thank you. Thank you to all the principals. As I said at the beginning, I'm very appreciative of all of the work that went on from all levels to prepare for this. As discussed here, we have been working through some options such as choice boards that would provide that flexibility differentiation. The professional learning will be ongoing with that. We knew that live instruction was going to be a hot topic coming back, but we also wanted to make sure that from the beginning of time, we had a sustainable focus on essential learning. And as many districts that began with that had to realize they had to stop and reset, we enhanced our continuity of education by bringing Google Meets on as support, review, and community building. But as we look to fall and preparing for various scenarios, more synchronous live learning would be part of that. We also felt very strongly when we began, Meredith Penner was very passionate about making sure that we weren't introducing new platforms and new technologies that would be barriers for kids, teachers, and families. We are happy to say that we've already been working through some platforms with teachers for K-1, firming up the platforms that we have for 2 through 5 and 6 through 12. And we'll be doing some professional learning on that next week so that we can prepare for that, and making sure that those platforms are not just beneficial in a virtual setting, but are beneficial for how we function day to day in regular schooling. I've just been really, probably more than anything, inspired most by the collaboration across the district at all levels. Teachers are sharing with us weekly that they are going to collaborate in a way that they have not allowed themselves to collaborate moving forward, because they're realizing how much stronger they are as a group. And as I mentioned, summer professional learning will be ongoing beginning next week. Then we will have some optional staff development options to continue this work leading us into the fall. So while this was an unfortunate, difficult situation, I'm really proud of the way that we've worked together. We've come together and worked collectively on this. Dr. Yanni, do you want to add anything here, or would you like to move into 5B?
I would just like to thank all the principals for their presentations this evening and all the data that they provided. And I'd like to thank Dave and Meredith and Phil along with the supervisors for all their hard work. I think, you know, the challenge that was before us was really, with no notice, how do you provide quality educational experiences for kids in a way that we've never done before? And I can tell you, specifically over the last couple of days, as we've been at graduation events and at different school-based events, over and over and over again, we've heard from teachers how much they appreciated the inter-department and across building collaboration. And so that, as a leadership team, we want to sustain that synergy. And it opened people's minds and eyes to doing things in different ways. And it has also created some good bonds that I think will last over time as well. So I really want to thank everyone, and to our community as well. You know, in one of our communications, we said we turned kitchen tables into desks and dens into phys ed spaces, and kitchens into science labs. So we are, that is not lost on us. We know that this was a challenge for our community, and we really thank everyone for stepping up.
Yeah, I think, do you want to go into item B and do that preparation, or should we do some questions at this point? What's the most practical?
Questions about this, and then we can talk about preparations for the new year.
Okay, great. So at this point, I'm going to ask any board members to raise their hand if they have any questions, so that we can address those. I see Miss Ionetti. Do you want to go ahead?
Yes. So it seems like at the grade school, the students finding the work was no problem, but then the feedback from the middle school was that it was a little bit more difficult. So if we were in this situation next year, how do we rectify that at the middle school?
So I think I'll jump in here, and then I'll let Dr. Clark or Mr. Hoffman jump in. I think making sure that all of our teachers are using Schoology in the same way, so that, you know, we like to give our teachers freedom, and we like to give them, but what became really evident here was everyone organizes their Schoology site a little bit differently. And so making sure that there is consistency for finding assignments, finding announcements, what have you. And then if teachers want to do more than that, that's fine, but making sure that we have that consistency.
And I think really, just to add on to that, we did provide direction to supervisors to work with their departments by saying each Schoology page should have a folder titled Continuity of Education Plan. Within there, you should have week by week. I think we had that pretty well established. I think what ultimately happened, to Dr. Yanni's point, was the teachers that then go above and beyond, it was even more transparent where to find some of that work, and then it wasn't on the other end. So I think even if we go above and beyond, it still has to fall into that same structure so that we have that one piece of communication.
Ms. Franczyk?
Thanks. You know, one piece just to add on to the Schoology piece, having now used it at home for a few months. I think your point is spot on. There were some people who did more in terms of adding more detail. I think the one thing that as a parent, and there's always little things, but knowing how the assignments will be weighted next year, because we would have to do something in terms of measuring the relevance of certain assignments. It was hard for me sometimes to put a value, like if we were having a rough day at the house and there was an assignment that wasn't getting done, maybe it was a 2-point assignment, there wasn't always a grade point assigned to it in advance. So just that little piece.
And Dr. Levinowitz, I'm sorry I skipped you over earlier, so go ahead.
No, I just raised my hand.
Okay.
My question is about extracurriculars and art, music, not as much phys ed. How did that how successful was it this time? And if you would have to do it again, what could we do differently? I know at the high school level, it's going to be extremely difficult to do music. And I'm just wondering how we approached it and how successful was it in the elementary and in the middle school.
So let me start with if we're back in virtual learning. If we're back in virtual learning at some point next year, let's take art, for example. Kids are as part of a drop-off, we would have to, send some art supplies. There are some tech ed courses that we can do remotely, but there are some things that would have to look different in a virtual environment. I really give credit to our teachers for finding those pieces that, transcend actual face-to-face instruction and virtual instruction. As we look to next year and as we look to next week, as we engage our teachers in professional learning, we'll be having those conversations and looking at how teachers can plan for that. What I'll say is I think overall our music teachers and art teachers were exceedingly creative in the types of videos that they were putting out and the types of opportunities that they were providing for kids. So one of the things early on, some parents were saying, well, after we get done with math and science and social studies and English, then there's, all this other stuff to do. But all that other stuff, is really not other stuff. It's really all complements the core, our core curriculum. And I think in talking with students, particularly at the secondary level, they looked forward to those types of things because they more closely match their interests.
I think I saw Dr. Davis's hand up earlier, but did you have a question?
I had a question. Art sort of took some of it, but I'm also wondering because Mr. Schultz talked a little bit about services were utilized at the high school level. I'm wondering how did that play out at the middle school and at the elementary level?
Dr. Davis, right when you said the important word to the question, there was some notification that went off. So, so how was what handled at the elementary?
I'm just wondering how guidance services were employed at the elementary and the middle school level, because I know for many of the children, they really struggled, not being with their teachers, and I know it was difficult for, parents, particularly working parents, to manage all of that. So I was wondering how their services were employed.
From elementary level, and thank you for repeating, sorry about that. From elementary perspective, Monday was Mindful Monday every Monday, and our guidance counselors worked together to provide some sort of activity that they would typically be doing with students in small groups of students or with whole school PBIS kind of work. And that was how we began each Monday as the fifth special, if you will, for elementary level. Throughout the week then, they worked on checking in with students. They would join Google Meets as surprise visitors, surprise guests to join the meets with classrooms of kids that they knew they needed to have a little bit of FaceTime with. They also worked very closely, and I know Dr. Clark would agree with this at the middle school. They worked very closely with the administration to check in with students when they weren't hearing from students, when performance was dipping off, when, or just those students, what we recommended was if the students who you regularly meet or check in with, how can you reach out to them and kind of check on them and do some wellness checks from there? I don't know if any principals have any other specific examples.
I think what Dave said, there was constant communication with teachers and our guidance counselors. And if there were any children that, were facing any type of anxiety with the workload or with just the virtual learning, there was phone calls made to the homes, speaking with the parents. I think the Mindful Monday was a great tool that was implemented every Monday, but the teachers were so engaged with their classrooms that any kids that were slipping or dealing with any types of of anxiety, there was constant communication back and forth with our guidance counselors and with the principals.
And Dr. Davis, I think that, we saw really a strong community bond through the work that our guidance counselors were putting out there, and the Mindful Mondays and the projects that kids were working on. It really became something where kids were motivated to submit work and do these projects that may even have been optional. And then we were able to honor them from our own building. I share a chipmunk update as part of a newsletter, and then kids seeing that, yes, that work was recognized, and we're looking at it, and we're honoring that work. I think it really, our guidance counselors just kept that community building, that relationship going and thriving with our students and families and staff.
And the Sandy Run counselors also, they were also liaisons with our community agencies. So each Wednesday in my listserv, I listed those community agencies, but parents sometimes hesitant, didn't want to make those calls. Our counselor actually linked a number of parents with the Aldersgate and the Marrakese and all of our service providers, so that the help was needed to be bigger than what we could provide at the building level or through our counselors. So we also had the Upper Dublin Police offer us wellness checks, right? So if they were specifically concerned, or if we were concerned about a family, maybe the child was non-responsive to the workload, the officers said that they would go out and check homes for us, and they actually did that too. So that lit the fire under some students and parents for us.
Thank you.
All right. I don't see any further questions. I have a couple of observations and comments to make before we move on. I think what I'm hearing is that the first 2 weeks, or the first period in which preparation was done for the continuity of education, seems to have really paid off, in the sense that the 5 E's were clearly established as a framework. Collaboration and some formatting and expectations were set right off the bat, as opposed to as you go. So I think that's really I think that's very exciting, and also I want to thank the administrative team for taking the time and having the courage, even if people were asking, well, why aren't you doing anything? Of course, they were doing things. It might not have been visible to everybody immediately, but I think we were all trying to figure out what life was like while being quarantined. So I think it sounds like that certainly has paid off. Some of the things that I would be curious about is what are some of the other things that, as we move forward, we have learned from this? I mean, clearly technology integration has moved forward by a big leap. But things like how things are, things maybe around grading, maybe around sleepiness. I know these are big topics, and we don't need to spend hours on this, but I was just wondering if some of those issues were, while I didn't see them as part of the questionnaire so much, but I would think there were perhaps some observations on those. Could you speak to those, Mr. Hoffman? Or?
Yes, sure. I think definitely the grading pieces, right? So we've just finished high school, a year in high school where we haven't had final exams. And so I'm really interested to have some conversations with Mr. Schultz and the team to say, so now what? What did we not know? What do we know? What was the purpose of those exams? How do we make final exams make sense and be meaningful? As a teacher, I always struggled with some of the final exams that my districts would give, because, the students never got them back. They never saw what they got on them. The teachers never were able to give the feedback back to the student, and it just kind of finaled into a grade. And so I think one of the most inspiring things that happened was teachers have started to ask, so what was I intending to do when I was creating that assessment? And so we're really seeing a shift, rather than how do I take this paper pencil test that I was giving and put it into an electronic form virtually. The initial shift was, how do I do that? I think where we finally got to was, what is the purpose of that assessment? And I think that that work is really going to be carrying through a lot of the work that we're doing so that we can have some of those meaningful conversations. There are lots of ways for us to know what students do and do not know and what the next steps are going to be. I think that our progress reports, for example, at the elementary level is going to show that we have observed something about what our students know. Here's what they're on the verge of doing next, and here would be my recommendations. And so I think that when we can have activities that go that way, it's going to be really helpful. I also think that Dr. Yanni and I have had some conversations, Meredith and I have had some conversations about the fact that the work that we engaged in with SEL, where it all comes back to the standard, the University of Washington Center for Leadership, the work that admin was engaged in this week, it all comes back to the standards. And what we're finding is where individual teachers or departments were struggling a little bit with the 5E framework, there was some confusion about content versus standard. And so I think that that work that we're engaged in is going to continue to be helpful for us. And so that's another thing that I think that we learned here. The sleepiness pattern, you know, I think more than anything, that's probably an issue we'll continue to look at. You know, it's a struggle. And so that's something we'll continue to look at, I'm sure.
Yeah, and of course, the situation at the moment is also that a lot of the other extracurriculars were not happening. So that certainly in terms of time management makes things different. But yeah, I would be curious to see if there's any information that might be gleaned from that. I think I saw a hand up earlier, but no, the hand is gone. So without any other issues, let's move on to the preparation for the school year 2021.
So thank you. Just today, the governor's office and the Pennsylvania Department of Education issued guidance around our ability to resume sports and athletics in the yellow phase. So Mr. Greiner, Mr. Pickford, and a number of folks are going through that guidance now, and we'll be meeting in a couple days to review their health and safety plan for resuming sports. Tomorrow, the superintendents from across Montgomery County have this as an agenda item, and I think what we're going to do our best to choose a date countywide when sports and athletics will resume. We are also in the midst of, we're being required to submit to the Department of Education on August 3rd, a health and safety plan for reopening our schools in September. We have to have a pandemic coordinator, and we have to have written, articulated safety plans and protocols about how we're going to monitor students, what we're going to do if there is a suspected or a confirmed case of COVID-19 in our buildings. All indications point out right now that we will be in the green phase and that schools will reopen. But despite that, we are planning for a number of scenarios because it takes 4 to 6 weeks for the trajectory of the virus to change. And so we don't want to not plan for a virtual scenario if we need to go in that direction. There's also some fear that once we open, we may see after a few weeks being open that we start to see suspected or confirmed cases of COVID in one or more of our buildings. And so we may have short-term periodic closures. But we're staying well abreast of all the guidance that's coming out. Some of the challenge with that is some of the guidance gets released and then in a couple days it gets retracted. So folks will remember the World Health Organization said children and asymptomatic people who are asymptomatic cannot pass COVID-19 on to others. So that was a real hopeful sign, and we thought, okay, that takes some of the pressure off as we're thinking about planning for the school year. And then that guidance was retracted. So we will continue our bi-weekly updates so that the community is aware of where we are with planning. We had 2 really successful Facebook Live meetings over the last couple of weeks. We'll be doing a few more of those this month in June, and a couple in July and August as well, so that we can give our community as much information as possible moving forward.
All right, thank you, Dr. Yani. Interesting times with lots of directives coming from different directions, it seems like. So I'm glad that you are keeping on top of all of that and keep us all informed. Are there any questions about this from the preparations for the next school year from the board? I don't see any at this point. All right, then I think I would like to thank all the principals for their participation and their contributions to this presentation, as well as, of course, our administrators who are always here. So what I would like to do next is go to the committee, committee reports and recommendations. And then look at items A, B, and C together. They are a renewal and some of the STAR testing materials, Newsella proposal, and Fountas and Purnell materials for grades 4 and 5. And Mr. Hoffman, do you want to add anything to that, or I have any comments on those proposals?
A is an annual renewal of our STAR. That's our assessment, adaptive assessments that we use in the district. Newsella, ELA, don't be confused by ELA. It's just the way that it's grouped. It is the pro subscription for K-8, which we're really, I'm sorry, 3-8. It starts with 3rd grade. It's best with 3rd grade. But it's been a fantastic, they gave us some of the most meaningful professional learning that our teachers experienced this year was with Newsella. They have a really great way of uniting disciplines, cross-curricular subjects, using vocabulary, individualized, differentiated. You can adjust the reading level based on the student. So everybody's having discussions about a text set at the reading level that they need, and the questions and vocabulary can be differentiated for those students. They've been unpacking some social emotional lessons. They also are really nicely aligning with TDA work, text dependent analysis, which our district does very, very well with, and this is going to continue to help us with that. And then C, the Fountas and Purnell classroom, as you recall earlier in, I think it was spring, fall, I can't remember at this point, when we fully adopted K3 and shared that we were going to be moving towards 4-5. Now that we're at the point of looking at our July 1 purchases, we do have the Heinemann information for each of the buildings to have access to 4th and 5th grade materials. We will be working with some grant money to help fund this, though we did have this in our initial general fund. We're looking to use some grant fund to help offset this, but it is a priority. We've had such success, and we firmly believe with the work that this program has brought to us and the exposure that our 4th and 5th grade students will have, that this program could continue moving forward. I don't know if Mrs. Penner has anything she'd want to add with 6C.
No, I would just say that the work that the teachers have been doing over the course of closure has really increased their enthusiasm around Fountas and Purnell. Teachers that weren't piloting or working collaboratively across the buildings with teachers that are piloting, so they had the opportunity to start to experience it, which was a really great lead into the professional learning we're going to have in June and to the pilot for next year. We're really excited to have our instructional support specialists as coaches for this as well, so that they can be turnaround trainers and be in the classroom supporting them. And our special education teachers are using the guided reading components in their instruction so that the kids, even if they're not reading on grade level, are are accessing more age-appropriate text, multiple genres, and using the same language that we're using in every educational setting, so that when they do transition back into the general education for that instruction, the transition is much smoother.
We also, one thing I would add, we have an implementation specialist. I mentioned her in our K3 conversation a few months ago. She's working with us. She now works with Heinemann, but was worked in an elementary school that was an early adopter of FMP. And so she's been fantastic working with us and working with our teachers. And we've been having a lot of conversations, elephant in the room, with them about their online resources. And they are working diligently. The day that we last spoke with her, at the end of last week, there was a call that day with Fountas and Pinnell Classroom working on what the online resources, and they're committing to having those student versions of those texts online and available for our students, so that should we need to go virtual, not only can we establish some sort of what I've been referring to with many of the supervisors, care packages. If we see them at the beginning of the year, having those care packages ready to go, should we have an indication that we need to close for a bit. Not only can we do that with our actual physical materials here, but they'll have access to the online materials as well as the teachers.
Dave, not to belabor the point, I just want to mention, in addition to these being high quality instructional materials, the texts are culturally responsive. And one of the things that we've been working hard in our libraries to do is to have books so that kids can see themselves reflected in texts. And Fountas and Pinnell has gone to great lengths to make sure that texts are culturally responsive.
Yes, thank you.
I think a question I had was about the STAR renewal. Does that have an online component as well? Should we need that, or is that purely a in-person physical?
That's all online. That's all
online. And Dr. Yanni and I have been having conversations about that we may come back to the board later. If our planning needs to look differently for the fall.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing any questions from the board or the committee members. Then I think we'll move this on to the legislative agenda for approval. Then let's go to items D through I, because they're all technology related issues, and I believe Mr. Hoffman is going to take that one too, those two.
Yes, Linkit is our data management software. This is what we gather all of our student data from local and state and national assessments. One of the most useful things that our teachers had access to this year, Dr. Miner brought this to our professional learning in beginning of the year, is called a Fingertip Report. So each student each teacher can see for each student where they are on a variety of measures, and can easily in one view kind of see that growth that's been very, very valuable for us. E is the Naviance software. That's the college search, education, counseling program. Frontline, I'm trying to see if there's anything. What letter are we going down to?
Through I.
Through I. Yes, Frontline, Schoology those are just yearly renewals. H is the Tech Ed and Computer Science lab at the middle school. We're replacing some desktops with laptops that will not only allow us to enhance some of the programs that our students have access to, but should we need to create some social distancing or some flexibility with class layout, we're not bound to having the computers along a wall of a classroom with everybody in a corner. So that's going to be a nice addition to the middle school, and the benefit as well then that those materials can move along with us as we grow into the new building. And I, Code HS, this is a program that will support our computer science programs at the high school. Initially, we were looking at getting new desktop computers in that lab. And Mr. Vinogradov and I had some conversations with Mr. Hayden. This program is completely cloud-based, which is allowing students the opportunity to access that those resources anywhere. So even if we're not in a virtual setting, students can continue their work outside of their lab on the devices that the school is issuing to students. So it's really a powerful system, and it'll be a great resource for us moving forward. We're anticipating to fund that as well with some CARES grant resources.
All right, thank you, Dr. or Mr. Hoffman / Vinogradov in this case, right? Let's see, any questions from the board about any of these items? No. I think Dr. Miner, did you want to say anything? I see no.
I don't have anything specific to say other than
Okay.
their standard agreements that have been, discussed with the board previously.
Okay. All right. I think with the Naviance, and maybe that's early to, I mean, that's not the right place here to talk about that. But in terms of the renewal, do you expect that there will be any changes in the information that they will be able to provide to schools that relate to potential changes in SATs and expectations on that? I mean, I think that goes more at the back end.
Yeah. So I think you're right. All of that's ongoing and fluid as schools are adjusting to what admissions requirements and applications look like at this point. But that system will continue to work with us, and many applications now have even moved to self-reporting, that the actual test scores are self-reported. So that'll be a process that I know Mrs. Ward will work with the counselors at the high school.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. I think then we can move those also on to the legislative agenda. Then we have items J and K. One is an educational agreement and a service agreement. Is there any?
I believe that was what Dr. Miner was referencing, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Then we'll move those also to the legislative agenda. And then it is time for community input. I believe we have, even though it looks like 2 community members, it's 1 community member who is joining us. Mrs. Vitella, do you have any input? I'm not seeing any, so then I think we can close community input. Then I think we're moving on to the announcement for our next meeting. The Education Committee is taking a break until August 5th, unless unexpected items will come our way. So our next meeting is scheduled for August 5th. At 6, I believe it's going to be 6 p.m., right, Ms. Evans? And then hopefully we will have an in-person meeting, but that will be determined at a later place. So at this point, I'd like to adjourn, and we'll have a brief intermission, and then we'll go on to policy. Thank you all for joining, and thanks for everybody's contributions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Wallach, is it okay with you if we do a 5-minute recess in between meetings?
Yeah, that's great. Perfect.
I'm going to keep recording though. So if we just want to go off your station for a moment.
Going to call to order the meeting of the Policy Committee for June 10th, 2020. We have a couple of items that we'll discuss in our meeting tonight. Dr. Yanni, before we begin, any announcements or communications?
There are no announcements for this evening.
Okay. Next on our agenda are the minutes from the May 6th Policy Committee meeting. Does anyone have any comments or questions on those minutes? They've been circulated previously. If anyone does, please raise your hand. Seeing none, we'll move those along to the legislative agenda for informational purposes. And we'll dive right into the task at hand tonight. We have a handful of policies that are up for second reading. We'll do those first. These are all policies that we discussed at first reading in our last meeting back in May. There have been a couple of tweaks to these policies, nothing substantive, and so that we're able to bring them back for second reading. The first is Board Operating Policy 006, local board procedure about meetings. Dr. Yanni, anything that you want to add about that on second reading?
What we did after the last meeting, we looked at the flow of the document, and we had some things in the definition section that really weren't definitions. And so we just rearranged the document so that it flows naturally and logically. The one change that we talked about right now, our full board considers approval of committee minutes. So tonight, the committee looked at May's policy minutes, and then at the June legislative meeting, the board would be asked to approve the May policy committee minutes. In talking with Mr. Diazio, our solicitor, the board approval of minutes is not necessary. So after the minutes are reviewed by the committee, they will still appear on the board agenda, the legislative meeting agenda, as informational items. They won't be approved by the full board because the full board doesn't attend every committee. But other than that, it was just formatting changes. And as we said last month, we, instead of trying to just retrofit this policy, or board operating guideline, we actually went back and rewrote it so that it fits and makes sense for what we're doing. And so it was a lot of work doing it, but I think we have it in a place now that serves us well.
100% agreed. Appreciate that. Any comments or questions from the committee or the board members? Mr. Sirota, your hand is up. Go ahead, Mark.
Yep. I just wanted to say thanks for the hard work on 006. I do think at the legislative meeting we should make a point of calling out that change to our procedures regarding minute approvals. I assume that means they'll be approved on the website or on board docs earlier as well. They won't have to wait until the legislative meeting before they are called done. And I think we should call that out to the public. I went through it one more time to look for other things that we should mention to the public that may be significant changes to practice. And I did not come up with anything else that I thought was important to call out. But I think if anyone else has them, it would be worth taking that opportunity at the legislative meeting.
And just so you know, just so everyone knows, Mr. Sirota, already in my superintendent's report for the June legislative meeting, I highlight that change so that not only is it said, but my superintendent report goes out as well. And so that can serve as a reminder.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Excellent. Anyone else? I think we've done a lot of great work on 006, and it's a proud accomplishment that we're putting that forth. Seeing no others, we'll move that forward to the legislative meeting. The next, I'll take them together, but we can talk about anything separately. We have 811, 812, and 813, which are bonding, property insurance, and other insurance. Dr. Yanni, anything to add on those on second reading?
No, just that we cleaned up the language per our last committee meeting. We reviewed them again with Andy Leckman, and our solicitor reviewed them. And I think they're now in pretty good shape.
Okay, excellent. Anybody on the committee or board have any comments? Mark, I'm not sure if your hand's up for these or if it's just up from before, but if it's up, please go ahead.
My apologies. I forgot to lower it.
All good. Anybody else on 811, 812, or 813? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move those forward to the legislative meeting. The next one we have for second reading is 904, public attendance at school events. Dr. Yanni, anything on this to note?
Again, there's something that I want to bring up, and it is on the second page of the policy. Under Code of Conduct, the second paragraph, in the interest of continued good relationships in the field of athletics, all spectators are asked to, number one, and number two, it was requested to look at those and particularly looking at number one, make that a little bit more broad of a statement to say, demonstrate peaceful behavior during opening exercises or other moments of silence, so as not to infringe on anyone's First Amendment rights. So I'm happy to make that change. It will not need to go back to a first reading, but I'll make that change. So it will say, number one will simply say, demonstrate peaceful behavior during opening exercises and any moments of silence.
Okay. So to be clear, that will no longer say anything specifically about the American flag or the national anthem. Is that right?
Correct.
Or the alma mater in number two.
Yeah. So what's the proposal for number two, Steve?
We would combine one and two, and we would just have that one statement.
Okay. I'm okay with that. I will just reiterate my comment from last month about this policy, that to me, it feels like it overlaps a whole bunch of other policies.
Mm-hmm.
While I don't think it conflicts with them, I haven't done a really thorough analysis of that, and I think somebody should. I mean, I think we need an audit to determine, is there anything in this policy that's already in other policies and half duplicating it? Is there anything that we don't need anymore? Is there anything, is it all said somewhere?
All
the related policies, I know it's aimed sort of at a different audience, but it's still, duplicate text always worries me because they're always slightly different and you never know which is the right one.
Right. There's minimal overlap, but one of the things that prior to it being published, I will put the reference policies in sections that appear in other policies. We'll make sure that they're referenced. And just so the committee and the board knows, I'm putting together a document that puts all of our policies on a cycle so that we know when they're up for renewal. And there will be a column on that chart that if that policy relates to any other policy, that information will be there as an automatic trigger for us to not only look at the policy that's being reviewed, but any of the policies that it's referred to as well. And that'll keep us clean and keeping the language tight.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
That's awesome. And Dr. Yanni, on that point, I think that there'll be some policies that'll even be on a yearly cycle to be reviewed every year.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, there'll be about 20 policies, in total that I want us to review every year to keep them at the forefront of everyone's mind, and also to make sure that our practice is concurrent with the policy.
Very good. I think the change to blend 1 and 2 as described is excellent. Does anybody else, either on the committee or the board, have any comments or questions about 904? Amy, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just really quickly, there was an elimination of language about the artificial noisemakers up under the code of conduct. And there's another item about artificial noisemakers under 7. So just wanting to get those in line.
We can definitely look at that. I think one distinction is that at least the one above that was deleted seemed to be targeted at any type of activity or any type of event, whereas number 7 is very specific to noisemakers inside, probably given the volume level being inside. If we think we should look at that, we certainly can, but at least in my head, that was the distinction between the two.
Thank you. That makes sense. I appreciate that.
Sure. Dr. Davis, your hand is up.
Is it part of PIAA regulations that you're not allowed to have those noisemakers in the gymnasium?
It is.
Right. So I think, so obviously it needs to be in our policy because it is part of PIAA as well.
Agreed. All right. Anybody else on 904? Okay, with that one change, we'll move that forward to the legislative agenda. And I guess potentially 2 changes, as Dr. Yanni said, he'll cross-reference any other policies as necessary before we approve it. Okay, moving on, we've got 905, which is the Citizen Advisory Committee policy. I don't think there were many changes at all, if any, but Dr. Yanni, anything on that?
No, we just cleaned up the language per our conversation at the last meeting.
Okay. Mr. Schroeder, your hand is up.
Yep, thank you. One of my comments last time, I have again, I didn't note what we discussed when we discussed it, so I apologize for bringing it up again because maybe we just decided to leave it alone. But when I read it again, it raised the same flag again. In the second to last paragraph at the very end, it says, all recommendations for nominations to committees shall be directed to the board president for compilation and recommendation to the board. Yeah, right on at the top of the screen now. And the part of that bothers me is it doesn't feel to me that the board president should be responsible for making recommendations to the board. I understand directing nominations somewhere for collection, but it seems like a collective decision of the board or of unless we always want to delegate that responsibility, but I don't think we want to delegate it necessarily to the president. It might be to an administrator, it might be to somebody else, whoever's appropriate for that committee. So that paragraph felt a little bit wrong to me.
So I think we can do a number of things there. We can either say board president or designee, or we can say board president or appropriate administrator, or board president and superintendent or designee. I agree with you, Mr. Schroeder. I think it needs to be, a little bit more, it needs to be a little bit more broad.
So the board president can delegate either to another board member or to the administration. So I think board president or designee is probably the minimal phrase that would accomplish that.
Perfect.
Slightly related, the very last paragraph, guidelines should be developed and shall be presented to the board for adoption. So the previous had a very active voice. It was specifically the board president. This one, they shall be presented to the board, prepared by somebody, by whom? this felt a little passive to me.
Well, I think quite honestly, it would depend upon who is in charge of the committee. So
yeah, it's going to depend on the committee.
Right.
Is it good enough to just say they'll be developed, or that is that before the committee is formed, they have to be developed and adopted, or is this something that the committee does once they're formed?
So thinking about making a real life example out of this, let's say we're going to do an ad hoc to look at enrollment projections, right? And I'm using this because this is likely not going to be a scenario, but if we did that, we would identify who was going to be in charge of that. I would think there would be some collective ownership. There would be collective ownership of the guidelines with the committee itself. And then I would see that being presented either by administrator or by a board member to the full board to say, these are the guidelines that we're going to operate under. Unless there was a specific charge. If the board directed that there be a task force or an ad hoc committee for a very specific purpose and a very specific outcome.
Yeah, that's a good point. It may be determined by whether, how this came about. Was it a recommendation from the administration or from the board?
Right.
And maybe it's good enough to leave it as it is. And maybe we did discuss it and decided again to leave it as it was. I'm not sure what else to do with it, even though it just sounded awfully passive to me. But it seems like it might be the best it can be.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think that the flexibility and the passivity of the language is probably beneficial.
That's all I've got.
Okay. Anyone else on 905? Going once, going twice. Okay, we'll move that along to the legislative agenda with that change we talked about in terms of the adding or designee. And I think we're up to our last second reading, which is 915, booster clubs and parent organizations. Dr. Yanni, anything on this one?
Yeah, so at our last committee meeting, we actually had a lot of conversation about this, and I spent some time with Mr. Dazio looking at the substance of the policy. And instead of calling it, instead of trying to parse out or have multiple policies, really for an organization to be endorsed by the district, there have to be some guidelines. And so the changes reflected in here reflect what we talked about last time, but we're referring to everything as organizations. So booster clubs are organizations, PTO, PTAs are organizations, everything falls under the umbrella of organization. And the administrative regulation, although we're not reviewing that this evening, I did make note that it's lengthy, but it's necessarily lengthy to make sure that we don't run afoul with any of the reporting that we have to do.
Very good. Appreciate it. Comments from the committee or the board? Mr. Sirota, your hand is up.
Yes, I did send a whole bunch of comments to Stephen Brook, and all of them have been taken care of except one, and it's still highlighted here. It's near the end. There's a section called Disbanding Organizations. And it says, should the board deem that the efforts or activities of any organization are not in the best interest of the district, the authorization to operate the organization may be withdrawn, which I understand the logic of it. That seems appropriate. I'm just wondering how that works in practice. I didn't see anything else in the policy anywhere that suggests that there is a formal authorization process. So I'm not sure in practice, how do we unauthorize an organization from operating?
So I asked Mr. Dazio that question because I looked at several other school districts and they have this same language, but they don't have language about the authorization. And Mr. Sirota, as you correctly noted, I think in your comment you said perhaps it's tied with the administrative or district liaison. If there's going to be a new group, a new organization, that would be brought forth by whoever that whoever that liaison would be, and we would bring that to the board. I'm not sure if that has happened in the past when booster clubs were formed, but if there would be, let's say, a new sport and a new booster club, we would bring that forth to the board to say, you know, we have this new sport, we have this new booster club, and it at least puts it on everyone's radar.
Right, and then at that time, you would say, and the formal liaison from the administration or from the district is this person, and so we would simply decline to name a liaison, and therefore they wouldn't be able to.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Exactly right. And in addition to the administrative regulation, we're going to put just together a chart that says, here's the organization and who's the person that's liaison.
Okay. That was it. I had there were probably 10 or 15 comments that I had made, and I'm glad, thank you for resolving all of those.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else? Committee or board? Seeing none, we will move that along to the legislative agenda as well. That finishes our second readings. We do not have any second reading repeals this month to discuss. So we're going to move to 502, which is our first readings. And I think both of these are actually renewed first readings. These were policies that I'm almost positive we talked about last month in a first reading, but they went back for more substantive revisions, and so we're bringing them back as first readings to the committee this month. The first is 901, the public relations objectives. Dr. Yanni?
So if everyone remembers from our last meeting, as we read the policy, there were a number of policies that we read, and some of them we didn't feel said much. And so really thinking about the policies, what we decided to do was to take 901 and to refer to that as community relations objectives. So lay out what our objectives are, and then take some of the other policies, publications programs, community relations, and media relations, and actually create ARs out of those. Some of the language in those were outdated. We talked about making media broad in its broadest sense. And we talked about, that each of those policies, they just seemed very slim, very narrow. So we grouped them together with 901 being the umbrella, and then the having multiple administrative regulations to go along with that.
Very good. Does anybody on the committee or the board have any questions about the reformulated 901 or that structure? Ms. Francic, your hand is up.
Not so much a question as a comment. I think this looks much better. And I feel like breaking it out allows us down the road to make adjustments in those individual areas as opposed to having to take everything apart. So I really like the direction this is going in.
If we find over the next year that this, that we need to change it, I'm going to put this on for review again next year around this time. And so, we can evaluate at that time if we need to make any changes.
I think that's a great idea. Anyone else on 901? Okay, appreciate it. We'll move that forward to the legislative agenda. And our last first reading for tonight is 913, non-school organizations, groups, individuals. Dr. Yanni?
So we also, last month's policy committee meeting, when I went back and watched it, was really heavy. There was lots of discussion about a lot of the policies. I believe we cleaned this up based on the conversations that we've been having, really trying to get at what is permissible and what is not permissible, because there is in school districts this inevitable gray area between what is school and what is non-school. So I believe that we have it in a spot for this committee to look at and talk about in the, to the extent that things make sense or that things do not make sense. And we move some items to the administrative regulations. One, and I believe, is Mrs. Ionetti still on the call?
Yeah, she's still on.
Mrs. Ionetti, was it this policy? I'm sorry, was it this policy that?
No, that was on the other one. I thought we were going to 9:15 that we talked about.
Okay, I'll come back to that.
Okay.
In a second. I apologize.
Sorry.
I apologize. But so I'm open to comments or discussion on 9:13, and I did include for the board and the committee the AR as well.
Does anybody on the committee or the board have any questions or comments on the reformulated 913? Not seeing any hands go up. I think that the revisions work and that it's much cleaner as done now. So, Dr. Yanni, we appreciate all the efforts in working with this one as well. Unless anyone else has any questions or comments, we'll move that forward to the legislative agenda as well. I think to your point, Dr. Yanni, if maybe it's a good time to go back. I think you were going to say something about the AR under 915.
Yes. So policy suggests that fundraisers are not mandatory, and there are also periods of time where kids go to like the holiday shop or the school shop, and when that happens, all students go, whether they have money or not. And if we're thinking about an equity perspective, we don't want to deny kids the opportunities to go, but we also don't want to put them in a situation where either the family doesn't want to buy something or the family can't necessarily afford to send the child to school to make purchases. So we talked about putting something in the AR that says that's consistent with mandatory fundraisers are not permitted. And also addressing, the shop scenario, particularly at the elementary level, that said it wouldn't necessarily be mandatory for every student to go.
Okay. Very good. As with AR, we appreciate you keeping us in the loop on that since we don't approve the AR anymore, but we appreciate the update and the sentiments being incorporated. Any questions or comments on that from the board or the committee? Okay. We have, moving to 503 on our agenda, we have two items for first reading repeal, 902 Publications Program and 911 News Media Relations, both of which are now being repealed because they've been subsumed either into another policy or probably more likely the AR that now underlies the policy of 901. Dr. Yanni, anything else on that?
No, that's correct.
Committee, board, any questions, comments? Okay, we'll move those forward to the legislative agenda as well. With that, we'll close section 5. We'll move to section 6 of our agenda, which is community input. Ms. Evans, I'm not aware of any questions or comments that were submitted in advance, correct? So we will turn it over to community input from our attendees. And I see a hand is up. Ms. Vitella, if I can figure out how to, can I do it, Brooke, or do you have to do it?
You should be able to do it, but let me try. I can take care of it. Go ahead, Ms. Patella.
He's still muted.
There. Okay. I have a computer and a phone, so that's my problem. So my first question is back to the policy, who can speak in a meeting? It's still, I guess, unclear to me who's considered a taxpayer. So if I'm an employee, I don't live here, I have Upper Dublin withholding, but technically I'm not paying Upper Dublin tax because that goes back to my home district. And let's say I'm a landlord, I own a building, I don't pay any taxes, but I do pay the real estate tax. Like who of those, are they both allowed to speak in a community input, or neither, or both? And I guess my other question is, I see a policy that's got a lot of reporting issues from the booster clubs, et cetera, all the clubs, which includes PTAs and PTOs. But I don't know who's in charge of that. And I thought part of the reason we got rid of a PTA-PTO liaison is that there was no jurisdiction over the PTA-PTOs. And yet it seems in that policy, there's quite a bit of jurisdiction. And I guess my third thing is, I'm not really sure, I half listened to what Dr. Yanni was saying in terms of a holiday shop. But again, isn't that a PTA, PTO? And then is the district somehow limiting what fundraisers they could have? I guess those are my questions. Thank you.
Appreciate it. I don't believe we have any other attendees. So with that, I will close community input. And do we have any comments or responses from either the committee or the administration? I think, Dr. Yanni, you want to go first?
Sure. So regarding the question about public comment, pardon me just 1 second while I pull the document back up, because I want to make sure that I'm speaking correctly. Just pardon me for 1 second.
I think it's on page 5.
Yes, 5 of 13. I apologize. Yeah. To district residents and district taxpayers. So that would mean if you own and live in the township, if you live in the township, and even if you don't live in the township, but you're a taxpayer to the township. It's pretty broad. At the last committee meeting, the question was, is staff or are staff members able to speak at community input time? The UDEA agreement speaks to that. It's the union leadership that can speak on behalf of teachers. And that's really because we have a number of other mechanisms, input mechanisms for teachers and staff. Regarding the policy for organizations, what I will say is probably over the last 5 to 7 years, school districts have gotten very lax with reporting mechanisms. The Auditor General has cracked down on several school districts, particularly when it comes to student activity funds and other organizations. So as our athletic director, Mr. Greiner, and as our principals and some of our central office administrators as being liaisons to these groups, we'll be reaching out to the various groups to talk about the reporting structures. The reporting structures look very intense when they're in writing, but I've actually created a template for the information that we need, and it's pretty palatable. So that information will be forthcoming to all of the groups. And regarding fundraisers and whatnot, I think the intent of what I said earlier was not to restrict anyone from buying or not buying, but if a family chooses not to, send students to school with money, we wouldn't mandate that the student goes to the quote unquote shop.
Which again, as you noted, is consistent with the policy provision that provides that, quote, mandatory fundraisers are not permitted, end quote.
Correct.
Okay. Any other responses or comments from the committee, Mr. Sirota?
I just want to just reiterate also regarding the community input question. The current language, community input is limited to district residents and district taxpayers, is how it has been forever. There was a draft of the policy that was different, and that change has been eliminated. So we're back to the original language. So this is not a change to policy. The specific question of who is allowed to speak is not a change to policy in this draft.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you.
That's correct. And I think the origin of that potential change was a bit of discontinuity with some language that had appeared on agendas for a period of time, but has now been rectified so that it's consistent with that policy, which is, as you noted, unchanged. Okay. Any other comments or points to be raised by the committee or the board tonight? Mark, I assume your hand is still up and not up anew?
Sorry, I gotta
No worries. All good. All good.
You know, we get really good at the Zoom thing just when we can resume in-person meetings.
Knock wood. All right. On that note, we will announce the next policy committee meeting is actually listed on our agenda as Wednesday, August the 5th. The meeting is actually going to be moved to August the 19th to accommodate a possible scheduling conflict. So instead of immediately following education on the 5th, it's going to immediately follow operations and finance on the 19th. And I appreciate the indulgence of both Dr. Yanni and the committee with regard to my potential schedule to do that.
Yeah, bring your coffee that night, or in Dr. Yanni's case, your Diet Pepsi.
No, you know what? We're all going to be very vibrant. We're going to be looking forward to a new school year.
Right.
You know,
right.
Maybe we'll actually be able to have an in-person meeting. It might have to be outside, but we'll have an in-person meeting.
And finance will be so exciting that everyone will be just vibrant and ready for policy.
Yes, yes. Maybe we could even hold it at the outdoor classroom at Jarretown. It would be just a lovely evening.
I love
it,
gentlemen.
All right, with that, I think we've made it through the agenda. I will adjourn the committee meeting. Since the next meeting is in August, we won't have policy in July. I thank everyone. Have a great night and a great rest of the week.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great evening.
Night.